I'm now going to introduce Dr. Ozan Ozavci, who is our speaker this evening. Dr. Ozavci is Assistant Professor of Trans-Imperial History at Utrecht University. And he's also an associate member at the Centre d'études turco-ottoman balkanique et centra-asiatique, so the Center of Turkish, Ottoman, Balkan and Central Asia Studies in Paris. He's also a co-founder of the Lausanne project with Jonathan Conlin, and some of you may remember that we had Jonathan Conlin as a speaker at the Royal Thames Yacht Club talking about the Gulbenkian family. Perhaps, Ozan, you'll talk a little bit about the Lausanne project either during your talk or afterwards, if you wish. Ozan specializes in Euro-Middle Eastern histories, ideology, security, diplomacy, and finances from the late 18th century until the present day. And in his previous research, he investigated the idea of liberty in the Middle East and the Caucasus, which resulted in the publication of his first book, Intellectual Origins of the Republic. This evening, he'll be drawing on his second book, Dangerous Gifts, Imperialism, Security and Civil Wars in the Levant. He's busy working on a third monograph, which looks into two Istanbul embassies of the Scottish diplomat Sir Robert Liston. And we had a talk on Robert Liston not long ago, and this will explore the intimate connections between the capitulations and peacemaking at the turn of the 19th century. Without more from me, I'm now going to welcome Dr. Ozan Ozavci. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm going to stop sharing and offer you the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Quentin, for this kind introduction. I'll just share my screen. Can you see it fine right now? Yeah. Okay. Well, once again, thank you very much, Quentin, and good evening to everyone. Today, in my talk, I'll briefly introduce my new book, Dangerous Gifts, which looks into the genealogy of great power interventionism in the Middle East. I'll begin my talk by discussing first where the idea of this book, and more specifically its title, comes from. I'll take you to the early 2000s and revisit the period in the run-up to the United States-led coalition's invasion of Iraq in 2003, when a hidden dialogue took place between the experts of the Middle East, such as late Fuad Ajami and Edward Said, about foreign interventionism. I will then introduce the contents of the book and draw your attention to a key episode in the book, to the 1840 intervention of the European great powers in Ottoman Syria, highlighting the role of one man played at the time, a British man he was, who I'll dare to call the forgotten hero of the British Empire because of his role during the 1840 intervention and its aftermath. So here is a photo of him. Can anyone recognize who he is? I apologize, the photo is not really very good. I took it myself at Oxford in the archives a while ago with my poor camera. Can anyone say who he is? Please just unmute yourself and tell me the name of this person. Well, I guess I wasn't entirely wrong. I guess I wasn't entirely wrong when I said he was forgotten. But the intervention he played a key role, the 1840 intervention, was monumental in the 19th century. I will explain to you why before finishing my talk with some of the main arguments and conclusions of Dangerous Gifts. My book is about the late 18th and 19th century armed interventions and their repercussions. But as I said before, its starting point is actually the beginning of the 21st century. Weeks before the campaign on Iraq, there was consensus among the proponents and opponents of the war over the fact that the intended invasion was properly imperialistic. Among the advocates of war was late Fuad Ajami, the Middle East expert at Stanford University and one of the most popular and influential advocates of the war, who reportedly advised neoconservative leaders in Washington, D.C., including Dick Cheney. In early 2003, Ajami was of the opinion that the British Empire's moment in Iraq had come after World War I, but London was economically exhausted and therefore failed. It was now the United States' time in Iraq, and its driving motivation, quote unquote, that imperial burden should have been modernizing the Arab world, should be modernizing the Arab world, above and beyond toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein. Ajami argued that the Iraqis would receive the intervening powers and their soldiers with open arms, celebrating their arrival. 3 years into the war, in 2006, in a book called The Foreigner's Gift, Ajami maintained that since the war was an effort to decapitate the despotic and lethal regime of Saddam Hussein, which he argues would have lasted 1,000 years otherwise, it was a legitimate, quote, imperial mission, a foreigner's gift, unquote, to the Iraqi inhabitants. It was a, quote, noble war, the outcome of which determined whether it's a noble success or a noble failure, unquote. On the day the invasion of Iraq began, the 20th of March, 2003, Edward Said, the Palestinian literary critic, theorist, and historian of Orientalism, anxiously warned against such postulations on benign imperialism. He pointed to the snares of seeing American imperial power as enlightened or even altruistic, which projects that enlightenment back into the past. A couple of months after the war broke out and days before he passed away, Said concluded that every empire would tell itself and the world that, I quote, it's unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and liberate, unquote. Said claimed empires tend to look at a distant foreign reality, quote, by subordinating it in one's case, constructing its history from one's own point of view, seeing its people as subjects whose fate can be decided by what distant administrators think is best for them, unquote. Said traces the beginning of this imperial gaze in the Middle East to 1798, the French invasion of Ottoman Egypt, and he candidly admits that he was only being impressionistic in his account of the discussion. A similar degree of impressionism could be found also in Ajami's account, who used the term imperialism as indistinctly, even if not pejoratively, in their hidden dialogue. This owed possibly to the contested nature of the notion of empire and the absence of a coherent body of literature on the intricate relationship on foreign armed interventionism in the Middle East back then. The situation in Iraq since 2006, and perhaps more recently in Afghanistan, possibly tells us whether these campaigns have proven to be a success or failure, a noble success or a noble failure, as Ajami puts it. The thing is, almost 2 decades after this intriguing yet elusive dialogue among Ajami, Said, and others, there was still no scholarly work today that historically, holistically, and contrapuntally explore the beginnings of great power interventions in the wider Middle East and the spiral of violence in the region, a gap in the literature that needed to be filled. I say it needed to be filled because in order to demonstrate that, because it demonstrates that Fuat Ajami was not the first to claim imperial interventions were noble enterprises and a foreigner's gift to the Middle Eastern inhabitants. Such literature would allow us to trace the continuums and long existing patterns in the mutual construction of great power interventions and internationalized civil or surrogate wars in the Middle East. It would also allow us to see the historical construction of the Western imperial gaze on the Middle East Edward Said speaks of. This gaze was in fact much more complex. It was a much more complex process than Said takes. Edward Said was also partially right. My new book, Dangerous Gifts, documents this historical complexity and seeks to explain why this historical complexity still matters. The subtitle of the book is Imperialism, Security and Civil Wars in the Levant, so from 1798 till 1864. I gave this subtitle because, geographically speaking, the book focuses mainly on the Eastern Mediterranean coast and their hinterland that range from Alexandria in the south to Beirut, Izmir or Smyrna, Istanbul and the Morea in the north. I decided not to use the term Middle East because the term did not exist back then, or at least it was not widely used. We don't know. And I chose the word Levantine to refer to the inhabitants of the Levant, regardless of their religion, mainly for brevity. And I'll do so in my talk this evening too. Period-wise, time-wise, this is a book about the 19th century, though its epilogue brings us to the 21st, to the invasion of Iraq and its aftermath. The period Dangerous Gifts mainly covers coincides with a time when unprecedented political, technological, military, and economic power differentials emerged between a handful of leading-edge Western European empires and other polities due to a variety of factors that more recently Barry Buzan and George Lawson outline in their work, The Global Transformation. They link it to the histories of industrialization, colonial exploitation, the emergence of legal rational states, and the ideologies of progress, but I won't go into that here. Even though foreign interventions have been a reality of international relations throughout history, what I say in this book, what Dangerous Gifts argues, is that a new practice of interventionism was configured at the turn of the 19th century, partially under the impact of the Enlightenment belief that once acquired, truth can be taught to others. I say this in relation to the reconceptualization of the notion of civilization as a process of transforming others for the better, which licensed interventionism. I guess you all know this. But more was going on at the time. A positivist, West-centric international law, still taken for the universal, was also developed and unevenly practiced through the course of the 19th century. The term great power emerged as a quasi-legal category after the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15. Economies all over the world came to be forcibly opened up, and new norms and principles in international affairs were endorsed. Principles such as conference diplomacy, collective action, non-intervention in each other's affairs among the so-called great powers to prevent a return to the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars with which the 19th century had opened. As importantly, this was a period when the global colonial competition gradually shifted from the Americas to Asia and Africa. And it was a period when a polity, the Ottoman Empire, as you see on the map, became central to the strategic, economic, cultural, and financial consideration of these leading-edge empires due mainly to its location and resources. The alleged perceived weakness of the Sultan's empire and how to deal with them was dubbed during this period as the Eastern Question. Though in every decade of the late 18th century, different powers, every decade since the late 18th century, different powers, be it Russia, France, Austria, Britain, or Prussia, had different formulations of and answers to this question, Eastern question, they oscillated between the total dismemberment of the Sultan's empire, re-erecting in its place a new Greek or Byzantine empire, or maintaining the Ottoman polity so that the balance of power among the major European empires would not be upset. But the Eastern question was not simply a question of imperialist opportunities, of expansionism or establishing dominant influence. It also symbolized a quest for security on the part of the great powers, yes, but also on the part of the Ottoman Empire and the imperial subjects, both Western and Levantine, or if you like, Middle Eastern. All these actors looked towards their perceived threats while furthering their manifold strategic, legal, economic, spiritual or religious and financial interests. However they defined it in a given moment, security became a driving force of their entangled histories. What I'm saying here is that Dangerous Gifts brings a very old and long debunked, dismissed paradigm, the Eastern question, back into the discussions. And it does so, it treats the Eastern question as a historical prism to understand the imperialism security nexus. Unlike the existing but hugely problematic authoritative studies, the canonical works like Anderson's, Dangerous Gifts considers the Eastern question not simply within the confines of great powers' strategic calculations, but it explains how it was first and foremost an Ottoman question, a question that the Ottoman elites and subjects dealt with and sometimes even manipulated as a trope to pursue their interests. The book aims to end this epistemological silence in the literature without depicting the local actors, the Levantines, as the mere victims or troublemakers of a complex history. But at the same time, Dangerous Gifts draws attention to the multi-layered quality of great power interventions. How, for example, economic and financial considerations in the first place, and to a lesser degree, religious ambitions informed diplomatic and political decision-making processes. So it panoramically explores the decades-long discussions about the future of the Ottoman Empire, even before the term Eastern question was coined. It embeds the French invasion of Egypt in 1798 into the larger Eastern question equation in the first part of the book. It discloses the financial motivations behind this invasion, and it also documents how 1798 epitomized a new discursive practice in the Levant. The invasion at the time was framed as an intervention undertaken for the benefit of the locals to emancipate them from the despotic Mamluk rule in Egypt. Or, as the architect of the invasion, the French Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice Talleyrand said just before the invasion, it was a grand service to the Ottomans. In a similar way, the 2003 invasion was framed as a foreigner's gift. You can find in the second chapter of the book, the Ottomans' reception of the invasion, how Sultan Selim perceived and experienced it and didn't really see it as a grand service to himself. And the book then moves on to the civil war in Egypt in 1802-11, just in the aftermath of the French invasion, when the Anglo-Ottoman Egyptian opposition frustrated Bonaparte's campaign. But just like in Iraq, the invasion culminated with an everlasting, long-lasting civil war. In the second part, Dangerous Gifts visits the diplomatic quandaries during the Congress of Vienna, the Greek Revolution, the 1827 Navarino intervention when the Ottoman, including Egyptian fleet, was destroyed by European powers, and how these paved the way for Greek independence. And then it narrates how all these affected the emergence of an empire-wide civil war, the one between Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt and Sultan Mahmud II and his ministers, the Eastern crisis that took place in the 1830s and early 40s. As I will elaborate soon, the first phase of this civil war culminated with the Russian intervention in 1833, which allowed Tsar Nicholas to establish dominant influence in Istanbul. But 6 years later, The civil war was reignited, and its second phase ended with the collective intervention of 4 European powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia in Mount Lebanon, which became the epicenter of Otto-Egyptian differences. Richard Wood, the forgotten hero of Britain, played a key role here alongside other historical actors. We will come to it in a bit, if I may build a bit more suspense for now. In the third and final part of Dangerous Gifts, the focus shifts from imperial metropoles to a mountain, Mount Lebanon. It traces how a cycle of internationalized civil wars took place there in the 1840s, and most tragically in 1860, that resulted in another great power intervention, this time with the involvement of all major powers, but despite the opposition of the Ottoman ministers. I like to believe that the real added value of Dangerous Gifts is its documentation of the degree of complexity that European and Levantine historical actors dealt with. The book consults not only European or Ottoman imperial sources, but also aims to blend them together into a narrative in reference to primary archival materials from Washington, D.C. to Moscow, from Edinburgh to Istanbul and Cairo, exploiting private papers and missionary archives on the one hand, in addition to, on the other hand, the archives of the imperial states. So by this means, the book considers both the diplomacies and political pursuits of historical actors and their mindsets and emotions. Let me illustrate this by example of the book's coverage of the 1840 intervention in Mount Lebanon. It's a very complex episode, but also fascinating. In this year, in 1840, 4 powers, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, joined by the Ottoman Sublime Porte, dispatched their navies and armies to Mount Lebanon to drive the French-backed military of Mehmed Ali Pasha, the governor of Egypt, out of the country. In fact, this is a well-known episode in history, how the 4 powers formed an 1840 version of the Quadruple Alliance, and how France was cast aside as it was opposed to the intervention. In 1840, London and Paris came to the brink of war. A war, they were about to fight the first war outside Europe for the first time since 1801, since the French invasion of Egypt. In fact, 7 years earlier, only in 1833, Britain and France had formed a common pact against Russia, where the Eastern question was concerned. In 1833, this was 2 years after Mehmed Ali, as you see on the left, the Pasha of Egypt, rose against Sultan Mahmud II to gain independence from his Ottoman overlord. He devastated the Sultan's armies. The road to Istanbul was wide open to the Egyptian army, and the Sultan was in a desperate situation. He was looking for help from the powers. For the first time in Ottoman history, against one of his vassals, an Ottoman Sultan would turn to the aid of one or another European power. He chose Britain. He asked the aid of the British. But the Grey Cabinet at the time was preoccupied with other issues, such as the Belgian Revolution in Holland or the upcoming elections. So the Grey Cabinet offered only diplomatic mediation between Cairo and Istanbul, but it was not enough for the Sultan. The Egyptian army was fast approaching to the imperial capital to end his reign. So what he did was accept an offer of help from an unexpected power, the Russians. The Romanovs were the historical enemies of the Ottomans. Only 4 years earlier, in 1829, the 2 powers, the Ottomans and the Romanovs, Russia and the Ottoman Empire, were at war. But Russian agents saw an advantage in interventions. They believed that they could establish dominant influence over the Ottoman government if they intervened on behalf of the Sultan. And they also saw Mehmed Ali as a threat with his much stronger army. So they preferred a weaker neighbor than a stronger one in their southern borders. But the thing is, the Ottomans were also very eager with the intervention, and I'm going to share with you a very interesting quote, which in a way appends one of the existing beliefs as to how the Ottomans came to be framed and seen as the sick men of Europe. In fact, it was the Ottoman agents that would call themselves as sick men for the first time. In 1833, during the negotiations between Ottoman and Russian agents for the Russians to intervene, an Ottoman diplomat, Behçet Efendi, who was at the same time the Sultan's private doctor, would say, "We feel some relief when we see that our disasters have served to expose in the face of the world the high benevolence of the Russian Emperor. We have been the sick, you the medicines. We tell you with great frankness that the representatives of Russia can henceforth be considered as the ministers, the sincere advisors of the Sublime Porte herself." The first phase of the war, of the civil war, ended when the Russian soldiers arrived in Istanbul to protect the Sultan. The Sultan made a truce with the Pasha of Egypt, and he agreed that the Pasha of Egypt could keep Syria, a very rich region and strategically important, and the south of the Taurus Mountains. But for the Sultan, this was, for Sultan Mahmud II, this was a temporary agreement. For now, he needed to rebuild his army before he could recapture Syria. Also, he needed to figure out what to do with the Russians. As soon as the Russian regiments began to arrive in Istanbul, the British authorities realized how big a mistake they had made by not supporting the Sultan against his vassal. A few years later, the British Foreign Minister, Viscount Palmerston, would say, "No British cabinet at any period of the history of England ever made so great a mistake in regard to foreign affairs," referring to non-involvement in Ottoman affairs at the time. This was because Britain's communication and transportation routes to India, the jewel of its empire, were now under the indirect control of Russia in the north through the Ottoman government, and in the south, under the indirect control of France through the Pasha of Egypt, at whose service were several French officers, doctors, and French-educated bureaucrats. In 1833, the Ottoman ministers and Russia even signed an 8-year-long defensive alliance, pledging in a secret agreement to close the straits, Bosphorus and Dardanelles, to warships in times of a Russian war with other major powers. This gave Russia an immense strategic advantage, testing the balance of power in Europe. This was why French and British agents were alarmed. They were trying to prevent the Ottoman ministers from ratifying the treaty, this defensive alliance, but to no avail. The treaty was signed. It was called the Hünkar İskelesi Treaty, signed in July 1833. By mid-1830s, Sultan Mahmud II realized that the constant meddling of Russian agents in Istanbul into the internal affairs of his empire, his bureaucrats, his ministers, was serving more to Russian ends. And he noticed the weak neighbor policy of Russia that Russia was pursuing at the time. There was this explicit correspondence between Sultan and his agents, mainly Greek agents, about this, and also between Ottoman, Austrian, British agents, who were daily consulting each other as to how to end this situation. What could they do if it was too dangerous and risky to push Russia out and end its influence in Istanbul by force, that is, by military action? What could they do? How could they end this? How could they push Russia out? they wouldn't be able to do that because it would be an invitation for a total war in Europe. What they did was to pull Russia into the system of European alliances against Mehmet Ali, French-backed Mehmet Ali, and warranting that the Russo-Ottoman defensive alliance would not be renewed. It was an 8-year alliance, as I said. The Sultan's agents, especially Foreign Minister Mustafa Rashid, was instrumental in all this. As a Russophobe, he actively sought to obtain the support of the major powers against Russophile ministers in the Ottoman court. It was Mustafa Rashid who agreed and persuaded to sign the Treaty of Baltalimani in 1838, which was a commercial agreement between the Ottoman Empire and Britain, and it fixed customs tariffs in the Ottoman Empire, it abolished monopolies, and it was extremely favorable to Britain and the other powers, and not so favorable for the Ottoman Empire, at least in the short run. Mustafa Rashid and Sultan Mahmud believed that they could obtain an alliance with Britain after signing this commercial agreement. Mainly because British agents had hinted at them during the negotiations that such an alliance could be signed. But the alliance, at least in the form the Ottoman agents wanted, an offensive alliance, did not come into existence. In 1839, days before Sultan Mahmud passed away, his army attacked the Egyptians again by itself. He had regrouped his army, but his army was devastated one more time. And it was at this point that the Ottoman Foreign Minister, Mustafa Rashid, would make two unprecedented moves. One, diplomatic. He wrote a memorandum to European leaders, French and the British mainly, and invited them to intervene, I quote, not by a single nation, but an alliance of the great powers, not in the name of liberty, but in the name of security, unquote. He detailed how the intervention ought to take place to stop the Pasha of Egypt who was now threatening Istanbul. And he wanted to prevent Russia to involve in the civil war once again single-handedly. Mustafa Rashid's second move was to spearhead the proclamation of this well-known Gülhane Edict, which initiated the Tanzimat era in the Ottoman world. But dangerous gifts shows that the edict was prepared and proclaimed not under the pressures of the powers, as has been noted in the literature, but instead to pressure the European great powers to intervene in the Ottoman domestic affairs against the Pasha of Egypt. In November 1839, when Mustafa Rashid read out the edict, his main audience was, yes, the Ottoman public, especially the people who were now under the rule of Mehmet Ali, the Pasha of Egypt. He pledged them, the edict pledged them a better life. It pledged that if they collaborated with the Sultan, they would all be equal before the law. Conscription would be re-regulated. The taxation system would be re-regulated in a manner to take their interests into account. And the other audience was evidently the European diplomats, statesmen, and public opinion. Mustafa Rashid and his associates, such as Husrev, such as Valide Sultan, they looked to frame Istanbul as the civilized face of the East. At the time, Mehmet Ali of Egypt was widely celebrated in France as the Napoleon of the Orient, as a civilizer. So Rashid and his associate were now using the very language that was rapidly gaining traction in international political thought. That very word, which had become popular, especially after François Guizon's 1828-9 lectures at La Sorbonne. That word was civilization. The question is, why would the powers want to intervene in the domestic affairs of the Ottoman Sultan? French politicians such as Adolphe Thiers, the prime and foreign minister, were raising exactly this question in diplomatic talks. They were suggesting that the powers should leave an issue between Istanbul and Cairo to Istanbul and Cairo. It's not a European affair. But for the other powers, Prussia, Austria, Britain, this was not left to Istanbul and Cairo alone. The Sultan's armies were no longer. The Egyptians could again end the Ottoman Empire if they march on to Istanbul. Britain wanted to put an end to the situation, as we said, because Russia had a dominant influence in Istanbul, the French in Egypt. The Austrians were likewise threatened by Russian dominance in Istanbul. The Prussians, they just followed the suit of Austrians, Prince Metternich. But the Russians, for their part, accepted to give up their privileged position, mainly for two reasons. First, seeing that Russophobe ministers in the Ottoman court, such as Mustafa Rashid, were gaining power and not willing to renew the defensive alliance. And second, the Russians simply wanted to break Anglo-French liberal entente in Europe. They wanted to separate them. This was how the cards were redealt in Europe by the end of the 1830s. The four powers and Ottoman agents signed the Treaty of London in July 1840. They gave an ultimatum to Mehmet Ali Pasha to evacuate Syria for him to return to Egypt. France was excluded from this treaty, and it created a massive fury in Paris. Adolphe Thiers was speaking of war. He would go to such lengths and argue that the cause of Mehmet Ali was the cause of France. The popularity of the Pasha of Egypt in France, and especially among French public, will help him galvanize the sentiments of the people at the time. And aware of all this, Mehmet Ali did not even respond to the ultimatum of the powers and the ports in 1840, in July 1840. He expected that France and the four powers would by no means go to war with each other for the Eastern question, so he resisted. So now in 1840, the question for the Allies became how to break the resistance of Mehmet Ali and France. What they did was a textbook example of how the devil likes to hide in details. Nearly a decade-long Egyptian rule in Syria had reached a point by 1840 where, due to heavy taxation, conscription, corvée labor, and deforestation, many Syrians, but especially the inhabitants of Mount Lebanon, the Christian inhabitants, were now seeing Mehmet Ali as a tyrant. In early summer 1840, an uprising had taken place, but Mehmet Ali had managed to suppress it. In July 1840, soon after the Treaty of London was signed, the Allies sent to Lebanon a man, Palmerston and Mustafa Rashid sent to Lebanon a man, the guy who you could not recognize, Richard Wood. He was a dragoman in the British Embassy, at the British Embassy in Istanbul. He was born in Istanbul in 1806 and lived in Syria on and off since 1832. He knew Turkish very well, and to a certain extent Arabic, as far as I could trace from his Arabic letters. He was appointed by Mustafa Rashid in July 1840 as an agent, Ottoman and British agent with extraordinary competencies. He was dispatched to Beirut. He arrived there in 1840 with the main objective of orchestrating another Maronite revolt against Mehmet Ali. Richard Wood helped distribute about 84,000 muskets to the inhabitants, provided them with funds and ammunition, mainly to the Lebanese Maronites, the Catholics, who were historically under French protection. Thus, French-backed Mehmet Ali, the civilized face of the Orient, or the Napoleon of the East, as the French newspapers would depict him in the late 1830s and 1840, were now suppressing the Maronites, who were historically under French protection. A Muslim leader was suppressing the Catholics, which quickly upended the popularity of Mehmet Ali in France. Adolphe Thiers began to lose public support, when he insisted on supporting Mehmet Ali, and he fell from office by the end of the year in October. It was soon after the bombardment of Lebanon began, and by November, 1 month after TI fell from office, Mehmet Ali was driven out. By early 1841, the Ottoman rule was restored, but Richard Wood would report from Beirut that, I quote, "The country may be said to have been administered by us, the British." The French consul at the time confirmed this, grudgingly writing to Paris that Wood was, I quote, "de facto governor general of Syria," unquote. The communication and transportation routes of the British Empire were secured. And Wood was the man of the hour, but he was quickly forgotten. His life story lacks even a Wikipedia entry today. I think he was an 1840s version of Lawrence of Arabia. If not, he was more influential in preserving British interests in the wider Middle East. The 1840 intervention played a key role. It was monumental in terms of the fact that it paved the way for collective great power interventionism, due mainly to pull factors. The Ottoman ministers invited them, they opened up an irreversible path at the time, where the Eastern question and the idea of civilization merged together, and then they were repurposed, as explicitly written by figures like Alexis de Tocqueville or Lamartine. They said that the powers were not to fight each other for the Orient, for the Eastern question, but the Eastern question should be a vehicle for forming a condominium, for collaboration, to cite Alexis de Tocqueville, for taming the fallen beast that was the East, that was Asia. What all these bring home, and the main argument of dangerous gifts, is that a new trans-imperial culture of security unfolded in the period covered in this book. I call it a culture of security because we can discern certain patterns of modus operandi of security as of the 1790s. To name a few, the most well-known one, the first, the entrepreneurs of interventions tended to have only limited knowledge of local realities. Their vision was often eclipsed by what Said calls the imperial gaze, which failed to look or chose to ignore the needs and expectations of the wider local populations. With an overconfident belief in their political and military capacity, the intervening actors strove to transform an extremely complex reality that they had, in fact, hardly understood in its entirety. If you look at how a new cycle of civil wars broke out in Lebanon just after the 1840-41 intervention, you would see the actions undertaken after the 1840-41 intervention became one of the vehicles of this new cycle of civil wars in Lebanon. Second, the intersectoral dimensions of interventionism. That is how economic, financial, legal, or religious factors informed diplomatic decision-making processes. These multi-layered dimensions, sometimes with hidden agendas, or the use of one or another sector to gain leverage over others, often determined the nature of interventions. One example, we cannot understand how the Ottoman authorities accepted the 1860 intervention in Syria without taking into account the financial situation of the Ottoman Empire and its dependency on European financial houses. Third, there were also persistent pull factors of interventions. As I just said, in 1839, Mustafa Rashid would write this memorandum and explain word by word how the intervention should take place. The same applies to 1840s and other periods. So a contrapuntal analysis, placing under the same equation the agency of both European and Levantine actors, permit us to see that, or see the active role local agents played in enabling interventionism. And the fourth feature of trans-imperial security culture, it was the gravest. it was counterproductive. For all its qualities I mentioned, the imperial gaze, intersectoriality, hierarchization of interest, and the complex dynamics of push and pull factors, it precipitated a paradox, an ever-increasing demand for security in its manifold forms, despite its alleged supply through foreign interventionism. The period covered in dangerous gifts saw a cycle of civil wars, violence in the Levant after each intervention. But even then, these 19th century practices have long constituted the blueprints of modern day interventionism, providing future statesmen and diplomats with models for creation of autonomous administrative zones, new administrative structures, retribution and reparation practices, partition plans, surrogate wars, and so forth. Well, to conclude, neither regime nor Said were entirely right in their postulations in early 2000s when they were speaking of the quality of interventionism. But I cannot blame either of them given the absence of literature at the time in the early 2000s. So my book, Dangerous Gifts, aims to fill this gap 20 years later. So I must admit, I was a little bit late. Well, thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ozan, for that fascinating talk. We'll now move to comments and questions, and we can do this several ways. You can turn your video on and wave. You can use the Zoom raise your hand function, or you can post a question in chat and I will read it out. So if anyone is ready, do give me a signal. But if not, just really a question about Richard Wood. You've sort of given us a tantalizing glimpse of someone that certainly I'd never heard of, and the audience, I think, either being modest, but maybe they didn't know either. What happened to Wood? Did he return to Istanbul? Or was his career, did it reach its peak in Mount Lebanon?
He remained in Syria for a while. In 1841, he was quite influential in Beirut. He tried to reorganize the country, introduced a new council, which some authors like Osama Makdisi argues was like an early example of how sectarian politics was institutionalized, though I argue in the book that Makdisi was wrong, because the Egyptians had already done a similar, introduced a similar council a decade earlier. By the end of 1841, Wood was appointed as consul of Damascus, because in Istanbul, a dramatic change happened. Mustafa Rashid fell from power, and a conservative government, which disliked the Tanzimat reforms, came to office, and they dispatched to Syria two very conservative Ottoman pashas, Najib and Selim. And they were trying to deteriorate, upset the British influence established in the region through Richard Wood. And they were partially successful. And Richard Wood was appointed to Damascus mainly to undermine the influence and the attempts of Najib, this conservative Islamist figure who was not really treating the Christian population of the city quite fine, well. It's a long story. I won't go into details, but for about 1 year, he had this hidden fight with Najib Pasha, and then he remained in Damascus for another 5-6 years before returning back to Istanbul.
Okay, thank you. I think I saw Gerald McLean wave. If you'd like to unmute, Gerald. Yes, over to you.
Yes, hi. Thanks. First of all, thank you. I'm really a 17th century person who's suddenly found himself working bang in where you are. So that was absolutely fascinating, enlightening, and I'll be ordering the book firstly. But two things. You say there's nothing had been written. I just wonder if you had any thoughts on Jeremy Salt's unmaking of the Middle East. That's a minor question. The other is really just an observation, since my own interest in Richard Wood has been back in the 30s, when he was working with the Ottoman government and British consular services to solve the Kurdish question up in the Black Sea region. And I wonder if that is just outside your Levantine scope, or whether that is part of this. It's a longer story of his influence, his intervening both in terms of commercial, religious, and ethnic disputes within the Ottoman Empire, and whether the Kurdish problem of the 1830s, 1840s, which is what I'm working on at the moment, is any part of your book. I'm sure it is, if only indirectly. So that's really a sort of observation. Is salt any good? I've enjoyed it. And what's going on with Wood in the 1830s?
Yeah, I'll start with your second question, if I may. First of all, thank you very much for the question. And I must also add very quickly that this book is also open access. So if you're interested in reading it, all you need to do is to go to the website of Oxford University Press, click on download, and you can have a PDF version for free because it was an ERC funded book. It is ridiculously overpriced. I hope there is no one from Oxford University Press here right now, but I really don't know how the pricing happens, but so there is an option, and maybe I'll share a flyer for the discount if you're interested in having a hard copy of the book. About Richard Wood and the Kurdish question, I did read and took notes on Richard Wood's experience with his Revandus and Pasha, and then what was happening with Hafiz Pasha there. But it is beyond the scope of my book. Unfortunately, I would like to be able to involve it. That said, Jonathan Parry of Cambridge University, he's publishing a book in February 2022 titled Britain and the Middle East, Promised Lands, Britain and Ottoman Middle East. It will come out with Princeton University Press. I had the opportunity to read that book. And Jonathan does look at the wider Middle East, while my scope is focused on Levantine coasts, the Eastern Mediterranean coasts. And I did so mainly to be able to trace the continuities between events, and I also had the word limit, to be perfectly honest, so I wouldn't be able to involve everything. But Jonathan Parry does discuss the situation and Richard Wood's other dealings. And about nothing has been written, I can say that nothing was written about, for example, the Ottoman reception of French invasion of 1798, how Sultan Selim received it, with a contrapuntal angle, meaning placing under the same equation both French, British archival sources and Ottoman archival primary and secondary sources. The same applies to the Congress of Vienna. To my surprise, this monumental event, this key event when a new international order was established in the 19th century, where the Eastern question was also discussed, I can say it with confidence, nothing was written in the English language about it. Even in the studies on the Congress of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire is mentioned in passing, but wrongly. Yeah. And the Ottoman agency is completely ignored due to lack of access to materials. And I'm not saying this to blame people. Of course, it might not be possible, but it is what it was. And the same applies to 1820s, during the Greek Revolution, the intra-elite rivalries between Ottoman agents in Cairo and Istanbul, and how they affected the degree of violence on Greeks, and how it's translated into an empire-wide civil war, these continuities, how the French invasion of Algiers was linked to the Navarino incident, and how the French invasion of Algiers was linked to the 1830s crisis. If you look at these intra-elite rivalries among different Ottoman pashas, you see a different picture than has been narrated in the literature. Or likewise, the 1839-40 crisis, it's usually told by focusing on one or more European statesmen, how, for example, Viscount Palmerston and his agent in Istanbul, Lord Ponsonby, or how Adolphe Thiers or French agents like Nesserode were piloting reforms, affecting Ottoman politics, stirring Ottoman diplomacy. without looking at the agency of Ottoman ministers and how they were manipulating, in fact, great power politics. So this is not a story of, a Manichean story of villains and victims, whatever. It's much more complex. And what I try to show is these historical processes, being loyal to them and involving into the picture that long silence voices like Mustafa Rashid, like Husrev, he was a very important figure, like Sultan Selim and Halet Efendi, for example, this Ottoman minister who was in France in 1800s, representing the Ottoman Empire. And in 1810s, after what happened during the Napoleonic Wars, he was simply hating all European powers and their diplomacy. He was calling them politicking, deceit. It was diplomacy meant deceit in the eyes of the Ottomans. Yeah. And when in 1814, 15, Ottoman agents, Ottoman Empire was invited, when a proposal was sent to Sultan to guarantee the territorial integrity of Sultan's dominions by European public law, and nobody has recorded this before, the Ottoman agents would say, no, we are not interested in that. We don't trust European international law. This is a very good question. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, very nice to meet you as well.
Thank you very much. Ozan, just everyone may have seen, but you may have not, that Claire Spencer has very kindly sent round a link to a reference on Sir Richard Wood, who ended up as a consul in Tunis in 1855. So just to draw people's attention to that. Any other questions and comments? I mean, it does strike me that the Ottoman Empire seemed like a patient. Did it really think of itself as a patient that was sick very early on? Or was it because everyone was prodding and poking it and worrying about it? I mean, how proactive was the Ottoman Empire in trying to strike up a strong alliance of itself that could stand up to being prodded and poked?
Well, of course, we are talking of relational dynamics. Huh? We are talking of interactions. It was a dialogical process, the Eastern question, and I think a key word here, it's a social scientific term. I'm a little bit reluctant to use it, but it's ontological insecurity. As of 1790s, especially when Ottoman agents observed how Venice and Poland could be partitioned or wiped out of maps, they came to ask themselves how to guarantee the existence of their empire within the international system, to which they were relying upon in this international system, the aid of the powers. And I think as of then, I mean, even before then, they had this constant belief that they as of maybe early 1830s, 40s onward, their empire was in decline, even though this notion of decline is much problematic. But they also believed that. They also believed that they needed urgent reform. The Janissary system was quite problematic. The Timur system was quite problematic. They all needed reform. I haven't seen until I read this Behçet Efendi note to these Russian agents in 1833, whether they were calling themselves sick or whether they were actually, persuaded in that, but they certainly believed that their empire was in decline and they had to revive what they called the circle of justice. And they had to, they needed this urgent reform. So about sick, whether they were persuaded on that, I don't know, but Behçet Efendi, who was the doctor or private doctor of Sultan, I don't think it was coincidental that he used that term. And yes, David Toll's Velvet Empire is an interesting study, but I'm not sure he is using Ottoman sources.
Okay, great, thank you, and thank you, Claire Spencer, for sending around that other reference. Any more comments or questions for Ozan on this topic? If not, Ozan, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the Lausanne project and some of your other sort of work that's coming up?
Yes, sure. So the Lausanne project is an ongoing project that I co-convene with Dr. Jonathan Conlin of Southampton University. The Treaty of Lausanne was the last of the treaties signed at the end of World War I, and it is the only treaty that persists to this day. Even though within Turkey, there is a large number of studies conducted on the Treaty of Lausanne, the Conference of Lausanne in 1822-23. Outside Turkey, the attention paid to this treaty is quite limited. And Jonathan and I decided to bring together a number of scholars to look at aspects of this conference, Lausanne Conference and treaty, which is seen in Turkey as the birth certificate of the Republic, though it's quite a problematic notion. And we look at this treaty by using the methodological structure introduced in dangerous gifts, meaning both contrapuntally. So we look at not only the relations of these major powers like the British, the Turks, and the Greeks that were sitting at the table during the conference, but also we look at the impact or lack of impact of these absent presences like the Kurds, the Armenians, like the Polish who were trying to influence the treaty-making process. But at the same time, we look at these intersectoral dimensions of treaty making, and we trace in the edited volume through the chapters of figures like Andrew Patrick or Mustafa Aksakal, how financial considerations, how oil politics informed the fate of the treaty signed in July 1923. We have a website, the lausannproject.com. I'm just going to type this. So maybe,
okay.
But I don't know if this will go to everyone.
It should do. I mean,
everyone in the meeting, yeah, okay.
Just to
so
clarify.
if anyone is interested, we have also blogs which we publish on different aspects of Lausanne. If anyone is interested in contributing, you're very welcome to get in touch. And we organize a series of workshops, conferences with the purpose of producing an edited volume, which will come out in 2023 with the Ginkgo Library in London. And we also intend to organize a number of exhibitions around the Lausanne Peace Conference.
I mean, if I remember rightly, the Lausanne Treaty sort of fixed the borders of Turkey.
Mostly, yeah.
But did it also, was it the treaty that covered the exchange of populations?
Yes.
As well?
Yes, exactly. In fact, there were more than one treaty. There were conventions signed, and there was a treaty in the end. The Greco-Turkish population exchange had a different convention, but yeah, we followed the convention and called all these, different agreements the Treaty of Lausanne, just in the interest of brevity. But that's true. The population exchange was discussed, the final form, and it took effect after the Lausanne Conference.
Okay, thank you very much. And what are you working on next? And is there anything that we can do to help with your research? Spread the word amongst our network. Seek new sources. Tell us how we can help.
Yes, I wonder why I don't receive any questions. Whether it was the speak was too dense, or I would be curious. But I am, other than the Lausanne project, of course, I'm working on different things. Maybe a short article on Richard Wood's Levant career. It's true that he went to Tunis. Anyone interested in Richard Wood can go to Oxford. St. Anthony's College Middle Eastern Center. There you can find Richard Wood's private papers where there are 2 or 3 different versions of his autobiography. Like I was born here, I served here, and I think someone has to write a biography of him for the National Biography Database. I intended to do at some point, but yeah, that didn't happen. And other than that, I'm now starting a new project, applying for funding for the international sanitary councils that were established in Alexandria, Istanbul, Tehran, and Tangier in the 19th century, which were the first instances of international health cooperation and intercultural health cooperation between European and North African, Levantine, West Asian actors. And if you know of people who are working on similar projects, I'll be happy if you could put me in touch and help me build a network.
Yeah, would be glad to.
Thank you.
So, unless there are any other comments, questions, or thoughts that might help Ozan's research, I see no hands raised.
Can I ask if anyone has read the book?
Oh, I see Claire Spencer.
Okay, yeah.
Claire, would you like to unmute?
Unmute. Yes, sorry. I'm sitting in relaxed state on my sofa, which is why I'm not tempted to put on the video as well. A couple of things. I wrote my PhD on Tangier, so I will go through it again and see whether there's anything. I mean, the cordon sanitaire, as it was called, was a big topic. So I'll go back and see if I can find any references for you. Just flicking through my new book on French imperialism in the 19th century, they mentioned that the Tanzimat reforms were largely based on French legal codes. And I'm wondering why that choice was made, you know, in the context of you saying that actually the decision to engage in reforms was also tactical, you know, meant for external audiences as well as internal audiences. What you have to say about the French influence, given that by the sound of it, it was the British who benefited most from outmaneuvering the French.
But thank you, Claire. If I may, I will be very happy if you could tell me more about Tangier, because it's a very new world to me and I really need to explore more. And about why the French model, why the French system was taken as a model with the Tanzimat reforms. Well, I'm not really sure. The discussions in the 1830s, before the proclamation of the Gülhane Edict in Ottoman archives, does not really suggest, does not really tell us much. But there is one element: Mustafa Rashid and his immediate proteges like Ali and Fuad, they were all admirers of the French system. Okay. And even though they are usually depicted in the literature as Anglophiles, yes, Mustafa Rashid cooperated with the British more than with the French during the 1840 intervention. And he was quite upset with the French diplomatic choices, mainly the choice of François Guizot in 1830, 1841 and 1845. But as a legal rational state model, he was very keen on the French system, and he followed it very closely, and he was an ambassador to Paris between 1841 until 1845. And the one thing that is often not quite taken into account in the literature is this Tanzimat reform process. It was a very discontinuous process. So the Gülhane Edict was proclaimed in 1839, but as I said, within 2 years, Mustafa Rashid fell from office. And then these conservative pashas like Izzet Pasha, Topal Izzet, Reza Pasha, they came to office and they were not really happy with the nature of reforms by taking these European, French or British systems as a model. They were really happy with it, and they, if not withdrew, they reluctantly implemented most of these reforms. And this applies especially to Lebanon. Until 1845, you cannot really speak of Tanzimat reforms being implemented. At least not you know, in the way Mustafa Rashid had envisaged. So I think we really need to take that into account. And after 1845, when Mustafa Rashid came back to office as Grand Vizier, from that point on, you would see the implementation of Tanzimat. And remember, he spent the 4 years between 1841 and 45. And the first 2 years, the initial reforms, especially in the tax system, completely backfired. The empire was in financially, like in a very, you know, tragic situation. But when he came back in 1845, he had spent 4 years in France, and he had followed them very closely. Kodaman, I forget his first name now. It's almost it's 8:20 here. My bedtime is approaching. But somebody, Kodaman, wrote a book about Mustafa Rashid's ambassadorship in France. It's in French. If you're interested in the subject, I advise you take a look at that book, and I'll definitely find it in my library and share it with you, the full title.
Okay.
Yeah. But thank you for the question. Did I miss anything?
Well, I was just going to come back and say, I got the impression quite a few senior Ottoman officials were educated in France. You know, we often forget, because this has been such an Anglo-Saxon century, that actually the lingua franca of the 19th century was French everywhere. You know, the Russians, well, you can confirm this quite a bit in the Ottoman Empire. And obviously British diplomats overseas often had to use French as, you know, the language they communicated in with their international counterparts. So how influential was the education system? And were there schools of thought that preferred appealing to the British, as your story seems to suggest? Or was it based on, you know, where each of France and Britain were placed in the issue in question? In other words, in this particular issue, the French were on the wrong side, supporting Mehmed Ali against the Sultan.
Yeah, that's true. A really large number of students were sent to France. Egyptian students, Mehmed Ali also sent them, I think from 1830s onward mainly, but in the 1820s as well, and from the Ottoman Empire. I think this became a practice more from mid 19th century onward, 1850s, 60s onward.
Yeah,
I can't really think of a statesman, a French-educated statesman before. Like Mustafa Rashid was not one of them, or all the main actors that I looked into until 1860s. The first non-Muslim minister, Davud Pasha, was educated in Prussia, in fact, not in France. Yeah, I think these are very good questions. You might like to read Akshin Somel's works, who wrote on Ottoman education system and how it was influenced by French and British and German models in the course of the 19th century. I'm afraid it's not something that I can speak very authoritatively, so I wouldn't like to mislead you. But what I can say is, yeah, it is true. And I mean, there is a really long story there about Anglophilism, which is the case with many figures in the 19th century as well. But then in 1870s, during the fall of Sultan Abdulaziz and the rise of Abdulhamid, and during the so-called Bulgarian massacres and this growing Turkophobia in Britain, it was a dialogical process. Some people in Turkey or Ottoman Empire or different parts of the empire were following the developments and discourses produced in Britain and France. So it was often a dialogical process. And by having said that, one of the major Anglophiles of late Ottoman Empire, like Mehmed Sabahattin, who was a nephew of Sultan Abdulhamid II, known as Prince Sabahattin, he would become an Anglophile while he was living in Paris, reading a book by Edmond Demoulin about the superiority of Anglo-Saxons and the reasons for it. And then he would tried to implement the British model in the Ottoman Empire, this model based on individual initiative and decentralization. But I guess we are drifting onto other subjects here. So I do hope I was able to answer a part of your questions.
Yes, thank you. My battery is running out, but I will, if we can have your contact details, I'll certainly send you whatever I can on Tangier.
Yeah, we'll happily connect you.
Yep.
Dr. Chidam-Ballam, would you like to ask a question or just point to your comments? Okay, so yeah, Dr. Ballam has put something in the chat for you, Ozan. We have a question from Ediz Hazir. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I am doing my PhD on the Roman Catholics in Turkey at the University of Groningen. So thank you for the presentation, it was very interesting. I want to ask you about the Armenian question, which was proposed by the British during the Berlin Congress, because France tried to use the Armenians by promoting Catholicism among the Armenians to pretty much have a political power over the Armenians. What did the British aim by coming up with the British question?
I guess you're Todd Weyer's student.
Yes, I am.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. To be honest, the Berlin Conference is beyond the scope of dangerous gifts. I finished in 1864. So what exactly you're asking is why the British came up with the British question, you said, but I don't know what you mean by the British question there.
The Armenian question. What did they aim?
What did they aim?
Yeah. As they brought up the Armenian question during the Berlin Conference, what was their goal?
What was their goal?
Yeah.
Well, they wanted to, I think, mainly the preservation and security of the Armenians, and for them not to share the fate of the Bulgarians or the Jews in Romania. You would find that with the Berlin Agreement, you would have these special clauses for the protection of the Jews in Romania, and Armenians, introduction of new reforms that would improve the living conditions of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, especially after the conservative turn, and especially with the increasing Turkophobia. And there were good reasons, especially at times of conservative pressures for Armenians and other non-Muslim communities to fear for their security. The treaty wanted to establish this basic system of security for them. I'm afraid I didn't study the 1878 treaty in detail, unlike the previous treaties. So this is all I can say, but it was one of those early moments of the notion of minority rights emerging in great power Ottoman relations and being explicitly codified in a Euro-Ottoman treaty. That I can say.
Thank you. I was just wondering what you were thinking about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Edis.
Okay, thank you for your question. Any last thoughts? We are almost out of time. No? Okay, well, let me just wrap up. Ozan, thank you so much for your very thoughtful talk. And the link to the book, how do we, you've sent it to us, is that right?
No, that was to the Lausanne project.
Lausanne.
I will just send the link to the book right now before the...
And if anyone doesn't get it, they can get it from us for Craig Enser, and we'll be happy to pass that on.
No, I'm just sharing the link now. Maybe before we say goodbye, if people click on that, they will reach straight to the PDF version of the book.
Okay, click on the link before we sign out. So, but anyway, thank you once again for a great talk. Thank you everyone for joining in. and we very much look forward to staying in touch and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah.
Bye-bye.